Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Stephen Hawthorne, and welcome to today's program. The German U-boat U-69 sank the American merchant ship Robin Moore. American warships gradually began to actively engage in combat against Germany. Informally, an undeclared naval war between the Kriegsmarine and the U.S. Navy had already started in the spring of 1941. In September 1941, the famous incident between the destroyer USS Greer and U-652 occurred. President Roosevelt's administration did not desire the attack on December 7th. The Americans had a different strategy, which did not involve provoking Japan until the war against Germany was concluded. German declaration of war were somewhat of a lifeline for Roosevelt's administration. The American Navy's response to Hitler's unrestricted submarine warfare. The United States, a world power, a nation that played a crucial role in defeating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, America officially entered World War II. But was it really that straightforward? Public opinion on the United States' journey to war is embellished with many myths and misconceptions. These include beliefs about American neutrality and how President Roosevelt's administration sought to break this neutrality and enter the war. However, the Japanese attack and the German declaration of war were somewhat of a lifeline for Roosevelt's administration. For instance, if Hitler had not declared war on the United States, the Roosevelt administration would have had to find another way to officially declare war on Germany, but not on Japan. The United States did not provoke Japan into war. They aimed to keep Japan out of the global conflict for as long as possible. This does not mean they were not ultimately aiming for a confrontation with this power in the future. The strategic interests of the United States and Japan were conflicting, and a military conflict between these two nations was sooner or later inevitable. President Roosevelt's administration did not desire the attack on December 7th. The Americans had a different strategy, which did not involve provoking Japan until the war against Germany was concluded. By December 7, 1941, America was no longer a neutral nation. Despite no formal declaration of war against the USA, American soldiers were already fighting and dying. America wanted to enter the war, but not against the Japanese, especially not at the moment chosen by Japan as the formal and actual aggressor. The United States intended to enter the war offensively against Germany, but defensively against Japan. Japan was to wait for its time. The attack on Pearl Harbor and the Japanese invasion in the Far East were surprises for the United States, but they were factored into the grand strategic war plan, summarized by the phrase, "Germany first." During the interwar period, the United States was seen as an isolationist country that wanted nothing to do with the turmoil in Europe. At the same time, the United States was an imperialist nation, expanding its spheres of influence. The United States played an extremely important role in Europe economically, specifically in the areas of loans, investments, and trade. American investments in interwar Germany were a very significant part of the program for building Germany's military power. However, we cannot say that the United States helped build the Nazi military power. It is important to understand that the United States of the interwar period was a fully capitalist country in every sense of the word. The U.S. federal administration does not control the flow of private capital completely. It can control it to some extent through regulation, laws, and legal changes, but it does not have total control over private capital. Interwar Germany was the second industrial power in the world and a large market. It is therefore obvious that American private capital and American corporations and banks were interested in investing in Germany. What Germany did with that capital afterward is a completely different story. In 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt came to power in the United States through the electoral process. He held office from 1933 to 1945, precisely the same years that Adolf Hitler was Chancellor of Germany. Both men held their positions until the end of their days, and both died in April 1945. The 1930s were focused on the effort to fully restart the American economy. Roosevelt, a president from the Democratic Party, concentrated on the issues of the Great Depression. Consequently, international matters had to naturally take a back seat during the initial years of Roosevelt's presidency. However, as the person responsible for key international policy issues, the U.S. president was very interested in everything happening in Europe. This interest stemmed from the fact that the stability of the United States was largely dependent on the stability of Europe. Americans faced two external problems. In Asia, Japan, which had conducted military interventions in China in 1931 and later in 1937. In Europe, growing issues with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Both Germany and Italy openly advocated for the revision of European borders and sought to build empires through conquest. These two totalitarian states were ideological enemies of the United States from the beginning. The United States, as a democratic nation, and totalitarianisms such as communism, fascism, and Nazism are mutually hostile ideologies. These ideologies propose completely different forms of societal functioning. Communism and Nazism preached armed revolution and the forcible imposition of their ideologies. Democracy, on the other hand, naturally defends itself against such ideologies. Leaders of democratic nations, especially the United States, intended to militarily oppose the spread of totalitarian doctrines. Roosevelt was a man who, both publicly and behind closed doors within his government, emphasized the necessity of containing totalitarian states as they threatened the global interests of the United States. Publicly, Roosevelt advocated for the idea of freedom, the freedom of individuals, the freedom of religion, and the freedom to make one's own decisions. He also stressed that the security of the United States would be stable when the United States was strong and when the principles adhered to in the United States were upheld in most parts of the globe. However, Roosevelt realized that the vision of building democracy worldwide was not entirely feasible. Nevertheless, he aimed for the United States position to be so great and significant that American values and interests would be secured on a global scale. At that time, the United States, as the world's largest economy, viewed its interests on a global scale. The USA had economic interests around the world, including in the USSR, where American investments were as intensive as in Nazi Germany. Corporations sold them technology. Roosevelt was convinced that if the totalitarian regimes crossed a certain line and started a new world war, the United States would, just like at the end of the First World War, have to enter the conflict. The Roosevelt administration, leading an isolationist and neutral country that had neutrality laws, faced a dilemma: how to convince its citizens that this was their war. From as early as 1939, Roosevelt publicly addressed the American society and the political class, including both Democrats and Republicans. He told them that America would only be safe if it thought globally. American elites were already thinking globally on an economic level, as they had global interests. Politically, this was not yet the case. The United States' influence on European countries in a political sense was limited in 1939. Roosevelt wanted to change that. The British-French alliance system, which was meant to protect Europe from war, clearly indicated that the ultimate outcome of the European war would likely depend on whether or not the United States joined the conflict. Everyone remembered that American intervention in 1918 was decisive. It was still one of many reasons for Germany's defeat in the war, but it played a crucial role in the collapse of the German Western Front. Due to its immense economic power, the United States could tip the scales of victory in any new war as well. Initially, the American administration did not intervene in European politics. However, everyone knew that the United States was the world's largest economic and industrial power, and that another great war would sooner or later compel America to join the conflict. The 1930s were a period of intense global unrest. Between 1936 and 1939, Europe was shaken by the Spanish Civil War. The idea of the League of Nations, the predecessor of the UN, was falling apart. In Asia, Japan was fully engaged in a military invasion of China. The world was already on the brink before September 1st, 1939. In January 1939, Roosevelt addressed the American citizens. The Munich crisis did not lead to war, but we as America had no part in it. Europe is simmering. The hour of the outbreak of a new world war is in the hands of other nations. It will not depend on us Americans whether this war breaks out or not, but we Americans should start thinking about being ready for it. At the beginning of 1939, as events in Europe escalated, President Roosevelt's administration began looking for ways to prevent this conflict. If that failed, the aim was to start supporting one side and condemning the other. By 1939, the American administration clearly defined its friends, Great Britain, France, and its enemies, Germany, Italy, Japan. This stance remained unchanged from the perspective of American policy. In American strategic planning from 1939-1941, the Soviet Union was never considered either an enemy or a friend. In plans such as the famous Rainbow Plans, where Americans planned how a world war might unfold, there is no mention of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was seen as a third-party state. It should not be an enemy, but at the same time, it was not a friend. The Americans were keen to ensure that the Soviet Union did not fall into the orbit of German influence or become a German ally. The war in Europe was primarily envisioned as a coalition war involving the French-British-American alliance against Germany and Italy. In the best-case scenario, the Soviet Union was expected to remain a neutral state. This stance would change during the war when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. Before this, the USA had imposed an embargo on the Soviet Union after its invasion of Finland. However, it should be noted that the embargoes and other restrictions imposed on the USSR due to their dealings with Hitler were always much weaker than those imposed on any other country. In the spring of 1939, Roosevelt still wanted to prevent the war by proposing a series of restrictions on conducting military operations to European nations. In April 1939, after Germany occupied Czechoslovakia, Roosevelt wrote a letter to Hitler asking if he was willing to assure that his armed forces would not attack or invade certain countries. The letter listed 31 countries, including Poland. On April 28th, Hitler renounced the Munich agreements and the treaty with Great Britain, read Roosevelt's letter to the Reichstag, and laughed at it.
Herr Roosevelt verlangt endlich die Bereitwilligkeit, ihm die Zusicherung zu geben, dass die deutschen Streitkräfte das Staatsgebiet folgender unabhängiger Nationen nicht angreifen, und er nennt Finnland, Lettland, Litauen, Estland, Norwegen, Schweden, Dänemark, Niederlande, Belgien, Großbritannien, Irland, Frankreich, Portugal, Spanien, die Schweiz, Liechtenstein, Luxemburg, Polen, Ungarn, Rumänien, Jugoslawien, Russland, Bulgarien, Türkei, Irak, Arabien, Syrien, Palästina, Ägypten.
Simultaneously, Roosevelt sent letters to Great Britain, France, and Poland, stating, "If this war is indeed inevitable, I urge you to conduct it humanely. Do not bomb cities, do not target civilians, fight as cleanly as possible, do not break treaties, do not cross mental boundaries. If you do, it will spiral out of control." Roosevelt's administration influenced, among other things, Polish operational planning for the use of aviation in September 1939, when the war broke out. Roosevelt asked not to bomb cities. Polish Marshal Edward Śmigły-Riedz prohibited sending bombers over German cities. Regardless of whether such bombings could have impacted the campaign in Poland, the Polish military consciously did not bomb German territory in 1939. They wanted to clearly show who the aggressor was and who was defending, who was breaking international agreements and who was not. By 1939, Roosevelt's administration was already very active. Roosevelt warned Hitler and Mussolini against starting a war. He issued the same warning to Emperor Hirohito. He wrote letters to them. clearly stating not to enter into war. The Roosevelt administration's sympathies were unequivocally with Great Britain and France. On June 8, 1939, an unprecedented event occurred. King George VI of Great Britain visited the White House. This was a political demonstration by Roosevelt's administration. The monarch of the nation to which the United States had declared independence in the late 18th century, a nation against which the U.S. had been distinctly antagonistic throughout the 19th century, was now visiting the White House. On June 8, 1939, Roosevelt showed that he was on the side of the British. Let us remember that this was a period just before the war, essentially direct preparations for World War II. The United States and Great Britain were united. This was a message to Europe meant to also sober up Hitler. The United States is not only the president but also Congress, where many politicians held isolationist views. In the summer of 1939, it seemed that Roosevelt's administration was isolated. Before the war, Roosevelt asked only for a discussion on amending the Neutrality Act. Congress did not agree. Roosevelt spoke with numerous senators and lobbied for changes to the Neutrality Act. The Neutrality Act prohibited the sale of weapons to countries at war. Roosevelt was very concerned about this. He had already told the King of Great Britain that when the war broke out, American soldiers would not immediately appear in Europe, but weapons would. However, if Great Britain declared war on Germany, formally, according to American law, the U.S. government would not be able to sell weapons to Great Britain. On September 1, 1939, the American president addressed the nation and declared that the administration must do everything possible to avoid participating in this war. Publicly, he stated that America could not be drawn into this war, but at the same time, on September 8th, he signed a decree to increase the size of the army. On September 21st, in Congress, the president emphasized that changing the Neutrality Act was necessary to help the countries attacked by Germany. Formally, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany after the invasion of Poland, but they were perceived by the American administration as countries attacked by Germany, since Poland was allied with Great Britain and France. In September, the president enforced changes in arms trade. From now on, arms could not be traded without the administration's consent. Previously, theoretically, a private American company could sell arms to Germany. In September, the U.S. administration prohibited trade with Germany, but began changing the law to allow private companies to trade arms with France. America had already taken a clear side in the conflict. The U.S. administration ordered the Customs Administration to detain German ships in American ports for as long as possible so that they could be intercepted by the British. Germany ordered its merchant fleet to return to the Reich and not to sail to American ports, as they were considered hostile. In the Gulf of Mexico, in September 1939, the American Navy could not yet formally stop German ships in international waters, but American destroyers followed German merchant ships and broadcast their positions on open channels. Thanks to this, British ships in the Caribbean received radio coordinates indicating where in the Gulf of Mexico the German merchant ships were located. In November 1939, the Americans passed a law stating that we are neutral, but we will sell arms to countries engulfed in war. However, only to those countries we consider allied or friendly. Germany wants to change the order in Europe, while France and Britain guarantee the maintenance of the existing order. The USA is interested in preserving the existing order. Roosevelt, step by step, prepared the citizens of the United States for a change in attitude, and he had an extremely effective method. The President of the United States had a tradition of delivering radio addresses to the citizens, known as the fireside chats, which were broadcast late in the afternoon. These were lengthy radio speeches where the president explained what he was doing and why. Even from the perspective of contemporary politics, this was an incredibly wise method, where the leader constantly explained to the citizens the motives behind his actions. Roosevelt was surprisingly candid with Americans. He explained the international situation, his motivations, and where the threats and opportunities lay. The fireside chats were a propaganda success, gradually changing the attitudes and perceptions of Americans. The president also gave official speeches, such as the State of the Union Address. In January 1940, in this address, he told Americans directly, "Whether we like it or not, we will be involved in this conflict in one way or another, and we must prepare for it. Let's not be caught off guard." The year 1940 was an election year in the United States. President Roosevelt announced that he would seek a third term. At that time, presidents usually served 2 terms, but this was not yet codified into law. It was only after Roosevelt that Americans adopted a constitutional amendment prohibiting any individual from holding office for more than 2 terms. Roosevelt declared that he would run for a 3rd term, citing that America was under threat with war ongoing in Europe. Whether we liked it or not, the war is there. Japanese expansionism in Asia was also escalating. He told Congress that he would ask for more money and, therefore, would ask the citizens for more money from their pockets, as Congress would not provide its own money, but rather the citizens' money. Even from the perspective of contemporary politics, this was unusual. A man running for another term during an election year told the citizens that things were bad and would get worse, and thus we needed to increase our efforts. He explained that we Americans needed to arm ourselves and asked for understanding as to why taxes needed to be raised. Roosevelt was not afraid to tell this to the citizens. He could not publicly state officially that we were aiming to involve America in the war, as he would lose the election. Instead, he said, "I, President Roosevelt, do not want to involve the United States in the war, but I see the threats, and that is why we must arm ourselves." This effectively convinced the citizens. On April 9, 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. Following the president's orders, the Americans froze all Norwegian and Danish assets in the USA. Interestingly, at the same time, German financial assets were not frozen in the USA because Roosevelt could not yet openly oppose Germany. He could not take such hostile steps against them as he considered it premature. He froze Danish and Norwegian assets to prevent Germany from using them. Exactly 1 month later, on May 10th, the same fate befell the Dutch and Belgians. Their assets in the United States were frozen. Each country attacked by Hitler had its assets temporarily frozen. On May 15th, when Churchill became the new prime minister and the German army was clearly advancing in France, he called Roosevelt and requested to purchase 50 destroyers. The U.S. president agreed, but said he needed the approval of Congress. The next day, Roosevelt addressed Congress and asked for $900,000 for American national defense. Roosevelt periodically asked Congress for additional funds. On June 10, 1940, Italy declared war on Great Britain and France. In another public address, Roosevelt stated that the victory of the gods of force and hate is a threat to all democracies in the world. America can no longer pretend to be a lone island in a world of force and evil. The narrative in American politics about the battle between good and evil is very old. Roosevelt used such phrases during World War II. He described Hitler and his regime as a tyranny of force and hate that must be confronted with democracy, where every person has the right to choose. Roosevelt's administration acted reactively. If the Germans or Japanese made a move, the American administration responded reactively. On July 26, 1940, the president imposed restrictions on the sale of fuel and scrap metal to Japan. The administration wanted to control how much scrap metal and gasoline flowed to Japan. This was not Roosevelt's plan to draw the Japanese into the war. It was a reaction to the deployment of Japanese troops in Indochina. Whenever the Japanese or Germans made a move, the American administration responded. Roosevelt responded to every German, Italian, or Japanese action with some form of sanctions. The Americans aimed to use economic measures to prevent countries they considered hostile or escalating future armed conflicts from taking further actions. The biggest reaction occurred after the fall of France, which changed everything on many levels. The Japanese found themselves in northern Indochina, a French colony, with the consent of the Vichy government enforced by the Germans when France lost its full sovereignty. This encouraged Japan to undertake military intervention towards the colonies of European countries, the Netherlands and France. This was the catalyst for Japan's war against the West, the first step of which was the presence of the Japanese army in northern Indochina. Simultaneously, this was also a turning point for the American administration. In June 1940, the president made what is called a fundamental strategic interpretation. The most important American general, General Marshall, came to him at the White House and said,
"France has fallen. It is uncertain whether Great Britain will survive. Our resources are still weak. Our land army is still small. Mr. President, it would be prudent to stop sending arms to England and adopt a solution where we primarily defend the Western Hemisphere and are on our own, I suggest halting arms shipments to Great Britain and redirecting them to our forces.
President Roosevelt responded to General Marshall.
No, General. Firstly, I believe that Great Britain will survive. And secondly, for it to survive, it must receive arms from us. Thirdly, if Great Britain loses, we will still not be safe. Ensuring the safety of the United States lies in making sure that Great Britain does not fall. The United States will not abandon Great Britain. We will stand by Great Britain because its fall would threaten our security, and its survival will ensure our security.
The Americans shifted into high gear. On August 14th, full military conscription was reinstated in the United States. The next day, August 15th, 1940, the federal government signed a contract with Chrysler to build the Detroit Arsenal tank plant. During the summer of 1940, contracts were signed with many companies to expand the industrial base for the construction of ships, airplanes, tanks, and ammunition. That summer, the American administration began allocating funds for the development of the defense industry in preparation for the United States' involvement in World War II. The fall of France was the catalyst for this shift, changing everything. In August 1940, Roosevelt mandated that 60,000 National Guard soldiers be transferred to the command of the regular army. America was gearing up for war as early as the summer of 1940. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese admirals would declare, "We have awoken a sleeping giant." This was not true. The giant had long been awake. The giant had not been asleep for a long time. Since the summer of 1940, America had been accelerating its armament efforts. A symbol of this accelerated rearmament is the date July 19, 1940, when Congress unanimously allocated $8.5 billion for fleet expansion. A year and a half before Pearl Harbor, plans were in place to launch 8 aircraft carriers, 6 battleships, 6 cruisers, and 115 destroyers. The Navy was to receive 15,000 aircraft from American factories. On September 2nd, a preliminary British-American agreement was signed. The Americans would be allowed to deploy their military bases in British colonies in the Western Hemisphere, and in return, they committed to providing the British with 50 old destroyers. The United States was gradually ceasing to be a neutral country. For Roosevelt, there was still one last boundary: the elections. Roosevelt's nemesis in these elections was America's national hero, Charles Lindbergh. Lindbergh, a hero to many Americans, was the biggest opponent of Roosevelt and his strategic concept. At large rallies, gathering tens of thousands of people, Lindbergh would say, "Step by step, the Roosevelt administration is pushing us into war. This is not our war. Let's not allow President Roosevelt to drag us into it." Ultimately, Roosevelt won. But on October 23, 1940, just before the elections, Roosevelt made a speech saying, "We will not participate in foreign wars and will not send our Army, Navy, or Air Force to fight on foreign soil outside of America." He then added, "except in case we are attacked." Later, on December 7, 1941, America was attacked and officially entered the war. Unofficially, America had already entered the war before it was attacked. When Roosevelt won his third term on November 5, 1940, he immediately began actions to intensify war preparations. This included supplying weapons to those fighting Hitler or the Japanese. On November 17th, he publicly announced the Lend-Lease Act. On December 19, 1940, the first American taxpayer dollars directly funded arms for another country, $25 million for 100 fighters for China. On December 29, 1940, Roosevelt publicly stated that the United States was the arsenal of democracy and that countries fighting for their freedom would receive weapons from the United States, especially Great Britain. Month by month, the United States was shifting further from neutrality. Formally, the Lend-Lease Act began in March 1941, but in reality, it was already in place by late 1940 and early 1941. Roosevelt also paid attention to propaganda. He built the foundation for the claim that they were fighting against those who threatened the freedom of democracy, individual liberty, and free trade. Using lofty slogans, President Roosevelt built his propaganda. After winning the election, he gathered his generals and admirals and told them that his goal was for the United States to be ready for war and that a strategy needed to be developed. Admiral Harold Stark, in late 1940, prepared the so-called Plan Dog Memorandum, outlining the war strategy. This strategy stated that America must primarily focus on the war against Germany and that American security on a global scale would be decided in Europe. The Japanese were underestimated. By the end of 1940, a year before Pearl Harbor, Americans were certain that the Japanese would make the first move in the Pacific. They believed the Japanese would strike first, and this needed to be delayed as long as possible. The Roosevelt administration, in implementing further sanctions, did not aim to provoke the Japanese into war. They wanted to warn Japan but not draw them into conflict. Declassified American reports clearly state that in Asia, the U.S. would initially be on the defensive. In the worst case, they would even give up the Philippines. They would not strengthen their forces in Asia at the expense of focusing their efforts against Germany. This did not mean, however, that they would allow Japan any aggressive behavior. If Japan attacked, the U.S. would first defeat Germany and then turn its attention to Japan. This was the war plan by the end of 1940. In January 1941, the American Army developed a strategic war plan against Germany. They partially adopted the British concept, which called for eliminating Italy from the war first, then strategically bombing Germany, followed by a massive strike on Germany at the first opportunity, aiming to defeat them in a prolonged, potentially several-month-long, decisive battle. From January 29, 1941, secret British-Canadian-American staff talks on joint war efforts were held. These concluded on March 29, 1941, and received presidential approval. The U.S. president signed the so-called ABC Plan, America, Britain, and Canada, a joint British-American-Canadian plan for war against Germany at sea. Neutrality patrols were already in place, which President Roosevelt increasingly extended eastward into the Atlantic. This was the American Navy's response to Hitler's unrestricted submarine warfare. The American president increasingly showed that he was not afraid of open confrontation with Germany. On March 1, 1941, Bulgaria was forcibly compelled by Germany to join the Axis powers. In response, President Roosevelt signed an appropriate decree on March 3rd. All Bulgarian investments and money in the United States were frozen. This was another clear signal to any country that chose to cooperate with Germany that it would end up on the U.S. blacklist. Interestingly, Germany itself did not yet have its assets frozen, but anyone who wanted to ally with them or fell victim to them had their assets frozen. Soon, however, the Americans would make it clear to Germany that the situation had gone too far. In the spring and summer of 1941, even before the attack on the USSR, a decree was issued on June 6, 1941, ordering the confiscation of German and other Axis ships that were in neutral American ports. On June 14th, German and Italian assets in the United States were frozen, just a week before Germany's Operation Barbarossa. This was a clear message from Roosevelt that open hostility had now begun. On June 16th, Roosevelt ordered the closure of all German consulates in the USA. On July 7, 1941, American Marines landed in Iceland, replacing the British on the island. This marked the first presence of American armed forces on European soil. From that moment, Iceland was guarded by the American Army. On July 25th, Japanese assets were frozen. On August 17th, sanctions were imposed on companies from South American countries that traded with Germany. From August 9 to 12, the famous meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt took place aboard the battleship Prince of Wales, during which the Atlantic Charter was signed. This charter would later form the foundation for the future United Nations. It was an open demonstration of the British-American friendship and alliance. In the summer of 1941, as part of neutrality patrols, American warships gradually began to actively engage in combat against Germany. Formally, America entered the war in December after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Informally, an undeclared naval war between the Kriegsmarine and the U.S. Navy had already started in the spring of 1941. The most spectacular action was the silent American involvement in the hunt for the battleship Bismarck by providing intelligence data, which ultimately led to the sinking of the German battleship. On May 21, 1941, the German U-boat U-69 sank the American merchant ship Robin Moore. President Roosevelt detailed this incident to Americans during his fireside chats. He spoke about every maritime incident, mentioning all American ships, both military and merchant, that were being tracked by German submarines. The president directly told Americans that they were essentially already at war with Germany and that the U.S. Navy in the Atlantic had orders to engage and sink German submarines if they posed a threat. In September 1941, the famous incident between the destroyer USS Greer and U-652 occurred. The destroyer dropped depth charges on the submarine, which responded with a salvo of torpedoes. Neither ship was damaged, and no one was killed. On September 11th, during his fireside chat, the president referred to this incident. He said, "It is time for active defense. We will not wait and watch as U-boats take positions to attack and start firing torpedoes at our British, Canadian, or any other ships. I have given the order to prevent this. If any U-boat approaches our convoys, even British ones escorted by our ships, we will fight the German submarines." In September 1941, an undeclared war between Germany and America began. However, it was already overt. Hitler, in his public speeches, said, "Roosevelt is pushing for war, ordering attacks on our ships, and we are only defending ourselves." To this, Roosevelt responded in his speeches, "No, it is Germany that is pushing for war, and we are only defending ourselves. But yes, I have ordered our ships to attack in situations of threat." This was communicated openly. On October 17, 1941, nearly 2 months before Pearl Harbor, the first American sailors were killed. The first American destroyer was torpedoed. A British convoy was attacked by U-boats near Iceland, and an American destroyer group rushed to assist and attacked the U-boats. The Germans, under attack from depth charges, counterattacked. The USS Kearney was the first American destroyer to be torpedoed by a U-boat, resulting in the deaths of 11 sailors. The damaged destroyer managed to reach Iceland on its own. The president informed the citizens about this incident. On October 31st, 1941, the USS Reuben James became the first American destroyer to be torpedoed and sunk by a U-boat. With over 100 American soldiers killed, the war was already ongoing. By October 1941, the war between the United States and Germany was already a reality. The American Navy was ordered to stop and arrest any German ship encountered at sea. This led to the dropping of depth charges, cannon fire, torpedo launches, the death of sailors, and the sinking of warships. The war had not yet been officially declared, but it was already taking place. Congress increasingly agreed with the president, and in October and November 1941, nearly all restrictions from the Neutrality Act were lifted. The United States ceased to be a neutral country. America's stance, already shifted through the Lend-Lease program, changed in terms of arms sales not only to Great Britain, but also to the Soviet Union from the summer of 1941. On December 1st, 1941, the president interrupted his vacation and returned to Washington because he received information about the concentration of Japanese forces in Indochina. The Japanese army in Indochina had been rapidly reinforced, indicating that a Japanese attack was likely imminent. The next day, he sent an official inquiry to Japan, asking for the purpose of the troop buildup in Indochina. The American administration wanted to delay the attack, but did not know where it would occur. The Americans also did not know that a fleet of aircraft carriers was crossing the ocean with the intention of attacking Pearl Harbor. No one knew this. The Japanese fleet was sailing in radio silence. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a complete surprise. The Roosevelt administration was focused on the Japanese forces in Indochina. As late as December 6th, Roosevelt wrote a letter to Emperor Hirohito saying, "Please stop this madness." In the United States, on December 4th, 1941, 3 days before Pearl Harbor, a very surprising and unprecedented event occurred. American newspapers published the secret American Strategic War Plan. One opinion suggests that opponents of the U.S. entering the war orchestrated a controlled leak to show that Roosevelt was pushing for war. The leaked plan, Rainbow 5, ultimately envisioned that by 1943, the American Army and Navy would have 10 million soldiers, half of whom would be expeditionary forces sent to Europe to fight Germany. Those who wanted to stop Roosevelt from going to war at the last moment were responsible for the leak. According to another opinion, The president's administration itself leaked the plan to show that war was inevitable and that America had a plan and was ready for it. On December 7, 1941, to everyone's surprise, the Japanese attacked. If Roosevelt expected a Japanese attack at that moment, he expected it in the Philippines, not at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attacked both the Philippines and Hawaii. This was an operational surprise. When the Japanese attacked on December 7, 1941, it can be said, understanding the context, that a weight was lifted off President Roosevelt's shoulders. Roosevelt had spent months preparing America for this moment. He had prepared the public. He had already armed the military. Not literally, as America would ramp up its armament efforts in 1942, but orders, weapon models, and new factories were already being built and designed. The U.S. was not starting from scratch in December 1941. They had been preparing for a year and a half for this moment. Their planning focused mainly on Germany, as they wanted to deal with Germany first. Hitler made it easier for them. On December 11th, he declared war on the United States. The U.S. administration did not need to find a loophole to go to war against the Third Reich. If our enemies declare war, then we can, with a clear conscience, say we will defend ourselves, said President Roosevelt. If we examine the secret documents, Roosevelt's speeches, and his public political decisions, we will see that Roosevelt was gradually preparing America for this war. It is absolutely not the case that President Roosevelt deceitfully wanted to drag America into the war. He did so because he believed, and rightly so, that the security of the United States was dependent on global security. America is part of a global empire, meaning its safety and interests are tied to the security and balance of the world. As Adolf Hitler wrote in his book titled The Second Book, a Europe conquered by Germany would sooner or later become an enemy of America. America would be Germany's enemy in a war for world domination. If Hitler accomplished the first step and conquered Europe, the second step would be to confront America. Roosevelt understood this perfectly. He knew that allowing Europe to fall under Hitler's blows would leave America next and isolated. For the U.S. president, the most important thing was the balance of power and the dominant role of the USA within this system. To add a touch of bitterness to the otherwise positive view, it should be noted that Roosevelt never viewed the Soviet Union as an enemy. He saw it as a state stabilizing the global balance of power. He viewed China in exactly the same way, similarly to the British and, to a lesser extent, the French. However, this caused the American administration to be willing to sacrifice small and insignificant countries, such as those in Eastern and Central Europe, to build this stable global power structure. Roosevelt's belief in the right of nations to self-determination had significance for Stalin in his policy of creating states in Eastern and Central Europe after World War II. The American idea that nations should govern themselves, but that great powers should rule, created the post-war world order, consisting of two blocks, the USA and the USSR. In this order, some European countries were independent, but also dependent on a great power. Unfortunately, in this case, that power was the totalitarian and cruel Soviet Union. This, to some extent, is also a consequence of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's policies. A man who, in terms of grand strategy, shaped the course of World War II and ultimately ensured that it unfolded and ended in the way it did. Thank you for your attention, ladies and gentlemen, and I already would like to invite you to watch our upcoming programs. It's worth to subscribe the channel. Also, feel free to join the comments section below. See you next time.